So Evan is an author of 10 books, including John Paul Jones, Sea of Thunder, Being Nixon, Surrender, your latest book, Work for Time, Newsweek, Washington Bureau. He's a professor who's taught writing and journalism at Harvard and Princeton. I love that he's a lawyer and went to law school. So my first question is, though, when did you know you wanted to be a writer as opposed to a lawyer?
That's a hard question because I wanted to be a lawyer to make money, and I knew that writers did not make money. So there's a conflict right there. Fortunately, I married a lawyer. She's sitting right there in law school, so that solved the problem. And I was able to afford to be a writer, and that's why I became a writer.
And did you ever practice law?
No.
And
she did.
But having gone to law school for 3 years, graduated from a preeminent law school, did you use that in your writing?
Yes. Oh, yeah. I mean, law school teaches you what they call issue spotting, especially first year. Tangled, complicated problems. What's the issue here? That's invaluable to journalists. That's what I did as a journalist. I worked for Time and Newsweek for 33 years, and that's really what I did was, what the hell is going on here? What's the point? What's this about? And law school was great training for that.
So why a book on Sandra Day O'Connor?
Well, they asked me.
And when you say they, who's they?
The family and the publisher. There's a little bit of a history here. I was approached by Random House. Oh, when was this? Mid-2000, 2005, something like that, 2004. To be basically her ghostwriter for a memoir. And I met her, and I realized that she was ambivalent about this because she did want to be remembered. She knew her place in history. Being the first is a big deal, and she was not shy about that. She wanted to have a legacy. But Sandra Day O'Connor is a very powerful person, but one of those few powerful people who really is pretty modest. She didn't like to boast. If you're writing a memoir, that's what you're doing, you're boasting. And she was that unbelievably unusual thing in Washington. She didn't like gossip. Think about it. I mean, and memoirs that sell are full of gossip. So I could see she was ambivalent about it, and that kind of went away. Then a sad thing happened. She got dementia. And they still wanted to have a book about her, and I'm not really privy to what the family's thinking here, but they came back to me saying, okay, no more memoir, full biography, we'll cooperate. And my conditions were, and this is, authors understand this, I have to have total access, but you cannot have control. I know that sounds unreasonable, but those are the games. And yet, when you think about it, not so surprising. If it's really an authorized biography, meaning the family has control, doesn't have credibility, readers have their doubts about it, and so my terms, which are conventional terms, were I need to have total access, but you can't have control over it. There wasn't one exception to that. There's always an exception. John, her husband, had a diary, a daily diary, and in order for me to have access to that, I had to show them what I was using, because that was a highly personal thing. He was critical of others, and they were sensitive to that. As it happened, it really wasn't a problem. I think I took out maybe one or two tiny things. So they had no control over it, but I had a lot of cooperation. We had a letter from her to her clerks asking them to talk to me and to the other justices. This is important on many levels, but when you think about it, the Supreme Court is a secret place. What they do, their opinions are public, but the machinations behind them are secret. And the clerks are sworn to secrecy to the court and to the justice. And the other justices aren't exactly out there on the street corner talking about what they do. So I needed a letter from her to them and to her friends asking them to cooperate. And I got that letter. They didn't all cooperate. I didn't talk to every justice, most of them, but not all of them. I think Osi and I, my wife and I, were deeply involved in this together. We talked to 94 of 108 clerks. And, it varied. Some were just, a few of them were just, I'm not interested. Some were very forthcoming. Others were dodgy about it. Fortunately, every year she had 4 clerks so that if one was talking, you could usually get the others talking as well. And I did something with them. Journalists, generally speaking, do not show what they're writing to their sources before they publish. The reason for that is you don't want to get into an argument on deadline with the person, and so I had a different rule here, and I've had a different rule for a while with this. When you're writing a book, it's a little different. I do show stuff to sources beforehand because this is the way this works. You show them what you're writing, and they go, "Oh my God, that didn't happen. That's not right. I didn't say that." And actually, they did say it, and you can show it. They said that, and so initially it's messy. You kind of lose ground, but only in the short term. In the long term, you get their trust, and then you can tell the full story.
So this is kind of later in the story, and I was going to ask it later, but you brought it up, her clerks. So tell them what clerks are and what you mean by that, because I think when you talk about a judge, you perceive someone in a courtroom who's there by themselves, working on a case or trial from early in the morning till late in the afternoon by themselves. But the appellate court and Supreme Court's different. So clerks means...
They mean a lot. Think of being a Supreme Court justice. If you're cranking out 75 opinions a year, you need a lot of help. And they get these super bright kids out of law school, typically in modern day Harvard, Yale, which is, I think, actually a mistake. We can talk about that. But they get these super smart people to help them with the opinions. They write typically these bench memos saying, this is what the case is about, here's what I think you ought to say. And then the justices vary. Some of them write their own opinions, some don't. O'Connor left a lot of it to her clerks because, and this is very revealing about her personality. When you think about great Supreme Court justices, you think about their turns of phrase and Holmesian eloquence and all that. Justice O'Connor's opinions are boring. Now, there's a reason for this, and it has to do with her modesty, not just her personal modesty, but her modesty about her role as a justice. She did not care about doing big sweeping pronouncements about the way things ought to be. She believed the law should move slowly and incrementally, bit by bit, that the Supreme Court was not the final word, the law of the land, although it was. She believed it was in a conversation with other branches of government. This is a critically important insight to her jurisprudence, to use the $5 word. She thought the court was engaged in this democratic process of establishing the rule of law, yes, of interpreting the Constitution, yes, but being very sensitive to the other branches of government, to the executive branch, to the state legislatures, state courts, all of that. And she was in constant conversation, if you will. And so her opinions were quite incremental, and she did not go for great, eloquent flourishes. So her clerks did crank that out. She was totally in command of what they said. And she often would go against her clerks. The clerks would all decide, we should go this way, and she would go, thank you, no, we're going that way. So there's no question about her control and command, but she did not actually write them.
So we kind of went to the end, and I want to bring us back to the beginning, but it was a great way to start because she is unique. So I'm always interested in how you come up with the title. So tell me how you came up with the title, and then, based on what you've said about her, did she like that title?
I stand in the shower for about a year trying to figure out the title because it's important. And, by the time she actually saw the title, her dementia was so great that I don't know what her reaction was. But I know that her heart would have liked it because she cared about being the first. She kept a poem in her pocketbook, although she kept in her pocketbook, the U.S. Constitution, and which she believed in and really was her Bible. And also this poem about a pilgrim who builds a bridge and doesn't go charging ahead, but is all about building a bridge that others may cross. And she knew she was the bridge from an all-male court to a court that had women. And that was a tricky thing because the justices themselves were not all that eager to see her. We're talking 1980, 81. You know, these guys, they just dropped the Mr. before Justice. They knew what was coming, and they just got, it used to be Mr. Justice. They just dropped that. They were having an argument about it should be Madam Justice. Or, you know. So they were grumpy about it. They really didn't want to have a woman in their midst. And the best story about this, to illustrate this, is the Chief Justice gave her
The Chief Justice who...
Berger, the Chief Justice Warren Berger, when she got on the court, gave her a study prepared by a psychiatric institute of what happens when a woman enters a group of men. How should this go down? And the advice was that the woman should keep a very low profile so that the men didn't get all unnerved by it. I mean, can you imagine her getting this memo from the Chief Justice? Nobody wrote better thank you letters or faster thank you letters than Sandra Day O'Connor. There's nothing in the files saying thank you for this. But that just illustrates, in a way, what she was up against. Most of those guys were not glad to see her.
So I love that you also included on the title at the bottom, you have first, indicating she's the first woman Supreme Court Justice. But then at the bottom you say, an intimate portrait of the first woman Supreme Court Justice. And by that I felt what you were trying to say, that there was more to her that started in the beginning.
Oh, sure.
So tell us about where she grew up, her mom and dad, and there's a quote from her mom, "Don't take the bait." So talk about that too.
This is so important to her. This is so important. First of all, if you go there, and Elsie and I did, this is a couple 100,000 acres, this ranch. I mean, a man on a horseback would take all day to ride across it. What they call headquarters, the farmhouse, the ranch house, is 8 miles from the road. It's beautiful, the way it is down here, but stark, bleak sometimes of the year. But it's their kingdom, it's their domain. And Mr. Day, her father, is the king of this domain. He is the absolute ruler. And he's a wonderful guy, and he loves his daughter, and he loves his wife, and he loves his kids. But he's a despot, and he's a bit of a show-off. And he would get, you know, after he'd had a drink or two, he could get going at night. And one thing that Sandra learned was watching her parents' dynamic, which was her mom, who was a very smart person, very well-read, very beautiful. She did not take the bait. When old Harry Day got going, Mom just would, you know, not take the bait, not let herself get into some stupid fight over nothing. And that was incredibly important if you're the first woman dealing with rooms of men who want to bait you, who are blowhards or hold forth. This was great preparation for the Arizona State Legislature.
And there's a great story about her having, I think, to drive out food or water. Yeah. Tell that story.
Well, she loved this. She would tell the story because it had a point. She is 12, 10. I mean, she's young. I think she's about maybe 12 years old. She can already drive because it's a ranch. You got to learn how to drive. She has a truck. And it's a roundup, which is a huge thing on a ranch. The roundup on this vast ranch can be anywhere. And her job is to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, cook the roast, cook the cake, load the truck. She drives out there. She has a flat. She hits a rock and she has a flat. She's a pretty small girl. She has to jack it up. She has to literally jump on the jack to get it jacked up. She changes the tire. She finally gets out there for lunchtime to the roundup, and her father looks at her and he says, "You're late." She said, "Well, Dad, I had a flat tire, you know." And he said, "Next time, leave earlier." Now, she would tell this story to her clerks. The point of the story is no excuses. Deal with it, you know. Don't come whining to me about, "Oh, I wasn't able to finish. You gave me too much work. I had to stay up too late." Blah, blah, blah. You know, don't do that. You know, this is a ranch around here at the Supreme Court, and you got to get it done. And we're going to be cheerful about it, and I'm going to be a loving person, as she was, but you got to get it done. And that was the lesson of the Lazy Bee Ranch. You got to get it done.
So why do you think she went to Stanford? Why do you think she went to law school? I mean, that was unusual in that era, wasn't it?
Well, her
Tell
dad.
us when we're talking about, when she was in
So
college.
this is so she was born in 1930. Go with the Great Depression, which is pretty tough on this cattle ranch. They end up having to slaughter some of their own cattle, and they're close to the edge of bankruptcy. But they were covering World War II. It was good for the beef industry. And her dad had always wanted to go to Stanford and had been sad that he had been unable to go. He had to go take over the family ranch. That's why he couldn't go to Stanford. So she's fulfilling her father's wishes. Her father saw how bright she was. And now being a lawyer, that was a lot vaguer because there really weren't too many women lawyers. That was not really a clearly defined goal of hers. She got to Stanford and had a wonderful professor who had about in Western civilization, basically taught her to aim high, taught her about the importance of the rule of law, and all that vaguely coalesced into the desire of being a lawyer. So she got early admission. Her senior year of Stanford was also his first year of law school. They had a program doing that then. There were five, I think, women in her class at Stanford Law School. She made the law review. Tough to do, law review.
Tell them what law review is. Yeah,
law review is, if you're a law school, most law schools, the smarter, the best, and the brightest make law review. It's sometimes 10%, 5%. It's the small, the best and the brightest. And so she's in that group, and she's super smart. Maybe the only person who's smarter in her class is Bill Rehnquist.
So tell that story, because they were in the same law school, in the same class. Yeah. So tell them about Bill Rehnquist.
So this is a story. We have, every once in a while, an author gets to have a scoop. So here's our scoop.
Tell them, you had access to everything. Nobody told you what you're going to say was in there. So, I mean, this was a real find and a scoop.
It is a kind that we would access, her papers were closed at the Library of Congress. We were given access to her papers in the Library of Congress. What I'm about to tell you was not there. It was in a closet in the Supreme Court that her secretary, for reasons best known to her, led us to. And so a box of personal letters. Osi and I were at the Library of Congress, a lot of great stuff, but we're going, where are the love letters? Where's the really personal stuff? Well, the really personal stuff was in a box in the basement of the Supreme Court, and her secretary led us to it. And I'm going through, and I find 18 love letters from Bill Rehnquist to Sandra Day O'Connor. And now it had been known that they'd gone to the movies together and they dated. That story was out there. But I'm in letter number 6, and it's letter number 14, and it's, Sandy, will you marry me? They had not even told their own families. Their own families didn't know this. And so I go, oh my goodness, what is this about? It was a little tricky because then I had to get permission from the Rehnquists. And he had been going out before Mrs. Rehnquist. He had been dating earlier and then dated later, so it was a little touchy. But I got permission. Rehnquist had fallen in love with her, easy to fall in love with her. She's beautiful and wonderful. And she kind of strung him along because she was going out with a guy named John O'Connor, but he was not asking the question. This is 1952, The idea is to get married. It's sort of good. They're not sleeping together, so it's simpler. But she has to string Rehnquist along for a while until she finally gets married to John.
So I want to talk about John, but there's a great quote I think you have in there about what Justice Blackburn said and whispered to Justice Rehnquist after she was confirmed to the Supreme Court.
Yeah. Justice Harry Blackmun leaned over to Justice Rehnquist. They're in their robes up there on the bench. And Blackmun leans over to Rehnquist and he says, now, no fooling around.
So she graduates top of her class, right?
Yeah.
Meets and marries John O'Connor.
John O'Connor. But the problem is 1952, she can't get a job. She's this brilliant.
They move back to Phoenix, right?
Well, she applies to, they get the list of the 50 top law firms in San Francisco and LA. She applies to all of them. She gets one interview. And it's not to be a lawyer, it's to be a secretary.
Didn't she go there thinking it was to be a lawyer? And
the guy,
interviewer asked her.
Yeah. Well, how are your typing skills was the question. Yeah. And she says, so actually was the answer. So I'm not sure she was working on the job as a secretary. You have to flash forward. The law firm is Gibson Dunn, big, fancy, powerful law firm in L.A. Years flash forward. It's now 1981, and she's getting a call from William French Smith, who was the Attorney General of the United States, and he's calling to get her to come to Washington to interview to be a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. But Smith had been a partner at Gibson Dunn. So he comes on the phone, and she says to him, "You wouldn't be calling me about secretarial work, would you?"
To me, that's the best story in the whole book because it shows a lot about her.
Oh, it does. And she'd like to tell that story. At Gibson Dunn's 80th or 100th anniversary, she got up there and told that story.
She's speaking at their anniversary.
At their anniversary, all these partners are sitting there, you know.
So what does she do then? John gets a job, of course, at a nice large firm in Phoenix.
He gets a job. He's an attractive guy. He's not Laura Review. Was he Laura Review? Yes, he was. He was Laura Review, but not as smart as she is. Anyways, he gets at the fancy law firm, and she has to hang a shingle in a shopping center, not even a nice shopping center, because nobody will hire her. And so she does whatever walks in the door for a couple of years, and then gets. But the thing about Sandra Day O'Connor, and this is also revealing, when she didn't get hired by the fancy law firms, she went to the DA's office, and said, "I want to work for you." And he said, "I don't have any money." She said, "I'll work for free. I don't have any space. I'll work off your secretary's desk." I mean, she just kept at it. He hired her, eventually paid her. And she said, didn't work out for me in the private sector, so I went to the public sector. Because in 1952, the door was open just enough so that maybe you couldn't get into a law firm, but you could get into the public sector. And she, in Arizona, kind of worked her way in, working for the Attorney General's office, and learned a lot and entered politics. And that was her road up. They wouldn't have her in her husband's law firm. That was sort of ironic. One of her husband's job at his law firm was to explain to women applicants why we can't hire you. Why? Because the clients didn't want it.
So interesting, the culture at that time, and to think all those little machinations. But so she's not one to give up. In a sense, it's kind of gets back to the way she was raised.
That's the understatement. Do you never give up? And she never gave up about anything.
So she's elected to the Senate.
She's elected to the Senate. There? And pretty quickly she becomes majority leader, the first woman majority leader of a state Senate in American history. Nobody noticed, but that's true. They got her in there for one said because she was smarter than everybody else. That's a good reason to do it. But also because she had good political fingertips and could handle tricky situations.
So you have a great quote that she was comfortable around boys. What do you mean? And by boys, it's almost derogatory. It's men, but she's talking about
in this time, in this place, boys.
Yeah,
they're misbehaving. Think of the Arizona legislature in 1975. Think of the lobbyists and the women and the you can imagine, and that's the way it was. They were. I mean, I won't tell you the crude stories that she had to put up with. But she handled it. People hit on her. She handled it with equanimity. She had a certain look. Don't mess with me. And so she wasn't actually hit upon all that much because she had that. She preempted it with that look. But it was a crude environment.
Tell us the story about Senator Goodwin.
Goodwin was the chairman of the House Budget Committee, and therefore important to her when she was Senate Majority Leader. And she had a very difficult time dealing with him. And at one time, he said to her, "If you were a man, I'd punch you in the nose." And she said to him, "If you were a man, you could."
So say it again, because it's a little nuanced. Say it again. It's really good.
If you were a man, you could. She just put him right down. Now, she didn't do that much. I love that story because it's kind of a great put down. But the more significant thing about that story really is how infrequently she did that. She didn't, she saved her bullets. She's following mom's advice. Don't take the bait. She stayed out of a lot of stupid, fatuous fights of males strutting around, sticking their chests out. She just avoided all that. She, for instance, she didn't get into she disappointed the feminists by not backing the Equal Rights Amendment because she knew she didn't really have the votes, and she could have done a lot of moral posturing about that and looked righteous and pleased various constituencies and interest groups. but she didn't really have the votes. And she was able to do the same thing quietly. She changed every single law in the state of Arizona that discriminated against women. Every single one of them. She did that quietly, without ruffling a lot of feathers, so she got it done instead of being a moral figure. Now, she's not against being a moral figure, but you have to get something done.
So, you know, in a sense, you paint a picture of her as being kind of a tough person, a cowboy, you know, from this ranch in the middle of nowhere.
A very good-looking cowboy.
Right, but she also hosted parties.
Yeah.
Was a cook, was funny. Tell us a little bit about that, because that had an influence on her.
Oh, it did. I mean, one of the things she did at the state legislature was have pool parties with a lot of beer. She said, lots of beer, with Republicans and Democrats, you know, bipartisan pool parties, because she was able to reach across the aisle. She had great relations with, what was the name of that guy? OC, what was the name of the guy? There was an Hispanic guy who she was always fighting with across the aisle. They had a great relationship. And he was a way left, I've just blanked on his name, way left, difficult guy, cranky guy. And she would literally reach across the aisle and take his hand. And, you know, that's how you got stuff done. I think she had like a 1-vote majority in the Senate, and they did a lot. They cleaned up a lot of Arizona government while she was there. Things like they put in a merit-based judicial system instead of electing judges. They put in a system that judges should be chosen by panels based on merit. That's not a small thing. She did all sorts of things because she was bipartisan.
So something I didn't know is you have this great story about how she indirectly had an influence on Reagan being elected. Tell about that.
Well, Reagan was a pragmatic guy, as we've heard from Max Boot, and in October 1980, there's about a 10-point gender gap in the state of Illinois, which is a swing state. And Stu Spencer, his political advisor, says, you need to do something about this gender gap. And what he does is he says, I'm going to appoint a woman Supreme Court justice. And that closes the gender gap in that. So it has an immediate political effect. Now, victory has 1,000 fathers. Other people claim to have persuaded Reagan to appoint a woman justice. And maybe, I'm sure Nancy had something to do with it. There are other actors in this, as there always are. But Reagan is a political creature. And he announced this, and he meant it. A lot of his aides thought, well, he said it, but he didn't mean it. And he made clear after he'd been elected, no, I mean it. We're going to choose a woman. The problem is there aren't that many women, Republican women, with the bona fides. There aren't that many women judges. There are only, I think, 6 federal judges in 1980 who are women. Carter started the process of appointing women, but it's still early days, and so she's not a well-known national figure, but Reagan is smart enough to see that she's relatable, that she's going to get along with the men, that she's not going to back down, but she's going to be able to deal with them. And Reagan, shrewd man that he was, is pretty quickly persuaded that she's the one, and she was the one.
So I think the statistics were there were 600 federal judges. She wasn't a federal judge. She started out as Court of Appeals judge. Yeah, she started as a trial judge, was on the Arizona Court of Appeal. 600 federal judges, only 8 were women, and of those 8, all were Democrats.
Right. Yeah, that was it.
So how did he land on her, in a sense?
He was lobbied from various people, including Warren Berger got a crush on her at a judicial conference, and I mean it. You could tell he's in love. There's pictures of him. So he lobbied for her. Her husband was politically savvy, and they got to Jim Baker. They worked Jim Baker.
And she made contacts with these parties that she had in Phoenix.
Yeah.
Goldwater.
Yeah. Goldwater loved her. Yeah. Goldwater said of Sandra Day O'Connor, the best woman I ever met. And meant it. Yeah. So she had a lot of people lobbying. Even Dennis DeConcini, the Democratic senator, lobbied for her.
So based on how the Senate confirmation hearings go now, you would have thought this would have been controversial and very divisive. But what was the vote?
99-0. Been a while since we had one of those.
So she's on the Supreme Court from 1981 to 2006. We only have 14 more minutes. We don't have enough time to talk about all of her cases, but it's amazing the cases she dealt with and how significant and politically controversial they were. Affirmative action, abortion rights, church and state issues, and we can talk about some of them in this question, but tell us about what her judicial philosophy was.
Yeah. Well, as I said early, she's looking for the middle. She's not an ideologue. She wants to find out. She's very worried about the consequences of decisions. That, you know, she's worried about the iron law of unintended consequences. Be careful when you make a ruling, because it may ripple out in ways that you can't imagine. And she was very good at picking her way through difficult issues, and I'll take two of them because they were very difficult: abortion and affirmative action. On abortion, Harry Blackmun, who's written Roe v. Wade, when she comes on the court, Harry Blackmun thinks, oh my God, she's a Republican, she's a Reagan Republican, she's going to be the end of abortion. That was not the case. As it took her a while to work out her own position on this. And she didn't love Blackmun's trimester system. He had analysis of abortion. She was not fond of that. But she found a middle ground that preserved a woman's right to abortion as long as the interests of the state did not put, as she called it, an undue burden on a woman's right to abortion. So she surprised Harry Blackmun by actually being the one to uphold abortion, with some qualifications, but she was the one who saved abortion because it was going down when she came and saved the day. And she did it by working behind the scenes with Justice Kennedy, who had been pretty sure vote against abortion, Justice Souter, and they formed a little cabal that saved abortion in the Casey case, and that lasted all the way to Dodd just a couple of years ago. On affirmative action, a similar thing. She did not like racial preference. She was against it in many cases. But she did feel in education that it was important to have diversity. She really did care about that. She was very close to Justice Powell, who'd been the swing vote in the Bakke case, who established diversity as a constitutional basis for affirmative action, for essentially racial preference, but she was uncomfortable with it. And she wrote in her decision upholding affirmative action in 2002, the Grutter case, she wrote that it's our expectation this will only last for 25 more years. And it lasted 23 years, I think. So I think she would have been a vote in the Harvard case, I think she would have voted to end affirmative action. I think it would have been painful, close call, but I think she would have voted to end it.
So in her 25 years, she wrote thousands of cases.
She did.
Tell us what it means to be the swing vote or the fifth vote.
She was incredibly powerful because she was a decisive vote in, was it 200 cases, I think. That's a lot of power. And she was political about it, but not grossly political. They don't log roll up there. They're not swapping votes. You know, it's not like the Appropriations Committee on the Arizona legislature. It's just nothing like that. If you read the case files, and Elsie and I have read her case files, it's a very principled, you would be encouraged to know how principled the conversation between the justices, how principled that conversation is on very difficult cases. They really do argue on a higher plane. Obviously, their political views come to play. Yes, there are people who are predictably right or predictably left, that's all true. But the argument happens on a very high plane, and she operated at that high plane, trying to find a principled way to get to a result, often in a close question, 5-4, and she could find that, but that gave her a lot of power. Now, one way she did it, this is an important story to tell, because it's not the way we are today. When she got to the court, the justices have lunch together pretty regularly. When she got to court, nobody's going to lunch because they didn't trust each other. Remember the Brethren, the Woodward-Armstrong book about the Supreme Court came out in 1980, exposing all the secrets. Well, the justices had gotten to this point they didn't really trust each other. Who's leaking? So they weren't going to lunch. Sandra Day O'Connor made them come to lunch. And Justice Thomas, Clarence Thomas, told me this story. He gets on the court in, what was it, 90, 91. And you remember his hearings were terrible, and he's beaten down, and he says, I just didn't want to go to lunch. And she would walk with him every day and say, Clarence, you got to come to lunch. And he didn't want to go to lunch. And finally she said, Clarence, you got to come to lunch. And he did. And he said it changed everything for him. Because he realized that even though they're arguing these tough cases, they're human beings. They got to get along. And lunch went from being something that nobody went to something that everybody went to because of Sandra Day O'Connor. They're not talking cases at lunch. They're talking movies, what their kids are up to. But she understood the human element is so important. And that time, I remember when she died, Senator Breyer said, who will do that for us now? Who will do that for us now? That was a happy time in the court, because she's not the Chief Justice. Her old boyfriend, Bill Rehnquist, is. But he's kind of happy to have her be, Justice Thomas called her the glue. She was the glue. And that's an important, there's no rule about this, there's no statute about it, but it's important to get things done.
And for me, it's interesting because sitting on the Court of Appeal, there's a real level of seniority-based part of being on the Court of Appeal in the Supreme Court. She's brand new, and she was changing all kinds of things. But I want you to talk about her clerks and her relationship with her clerks. And there's a great story about when they were working late one night, and she told them to go home. But tell us about her clerks.
Well, they were intimidated. She's kind of scary. When the first time I met her, I mean, she's scary. But beneath the scariness is a deep human empathy and warmth. And her clerks, the arc was usually went from fear to love. It took a year, but it didn't always happen. But it often happened because she cared about them. She cared about their children. She got them jobs. And they had a ritual there. I love this. She was not, we live in an age where we are always praising our kids. And these Supreme Court clerks are magna cum this and that, and summa cum, and they're the top of the heap, and they think they're pretty great when they get there. And she did not hand out a lot of gratuitous praise. So in the clerk's room, there was on the wall, they took a Xerox of her hand, and they put it up on the wall underneath a sign that says, if you want a pat on the back, lean here. And that's the way she was, but they loved her for it. And she, a sort of old-fashioned lesson in tough love.
And she had mandatory exercise in the morning,
Oh, my
walks
God.
in the afternoon, and
Actually, she had a speech to the clerks. It was wonderful. It's not just about the law and studying cases. You need to have a full life. You need to go to dinner parties. You need to exercise. She ran an exercise class in the morning for women, not for men. Men couldn't go. But an exercise class in the morning. She took them on to museums. She took them on hikes down to the Jefferson Memorial in the rain and wind. I mean, they were always complaining about it because they had tons of work. And the story you referred to is she comes back from the opera or something, and there they all are working late at night. And she says, what are you doing here? Well, they're working for her. They're getting her opinions ready. And she said, go home. And they said, well, one of them says, well, does that mean the memo that you want at 8 o'clock is not due at 8? She said, no. You still have to do it. So they all left. She left, and then they all came back.
So John kind of followed her around.
He did.
And ended up in Washington, D.C. Probably didn't end up with the job that he would have wanted.
No.
Now we're later in life, and he ends up with Alzheimer's. And tell us how that impacted her and him.
It's a mean and terrible disease, and it crept over him early. And they could see, they were in denial for a long time, but it, eventually got him. She was determined to take care of him, and she would bring him to her chambers. She took him out to dinner. There was no parking him. She took him everywhere. It got harder and harder. She couldn't sleep because he couldn't sleep, and they slept in the same bed, and it got tougher and tougher. And really finally got to the point where she had to quit to take care of him. And she said, he sacrificed for me. When she was offered the job, she said, you know, he was a big cheese lawyer. He was kind of the king of the bar in Phoenix and ran the city in many ways in this sort of that civic way that top lawyers do. And he said, you know, there's no question. Of course we're going to Washington. Of course we're going to. And he did not get the job he wanted. He didn't. His law really didn't work in Washington law, and he was diminished by it. But so she said, he sacrificed for me. Now I'm going to sacrifice for him. And she took him home, but his dementia got worse, and she did have to put him into a home. And of course, as can sometimes happen, he formed what they call a mistaken attachment with another woman. And he would be there holding the other woman's hand, and she would come in and hold his other hand. And she never complained about it. She cried about it, but she never complained about it.
So we have to talk about Bush versus Gore. Yeah. Tell us how she felt about that.
It tore her apart. You may recall this. The vote's a tie, basically, in 2000, and the case goes to the court. She didn't want it to get there, but it did. And it's ugly because it's 5-4, all the Republicans on one side to stop the recount process. Remember this? They were doing a recount, and the Republicans, the 5 of them, stop it for Democrats. So it looks nakedly political. And this really bothered her. Her reasoning is a little complicated, but I need to explain it because she's taken a lot of grief for this over the years. It looks like she was part of a partisan process. She's a pragmatist, and she knows that George Bush had already been certified by the Florida Secretary of State as the winner. If they had a recount and Gore won, now you would have 2 people having been certified as a winner. Under an 1876 law, it goes back to Congress. Each house has a vote. The Republicans have the House has a vote, the Senate, each has a vote. As it happened, the House was going to be Democratic, the Senate was going to be Republican. Under this law, in the event of a tie, which it would have been, who breaks the tie? The governor of the state. The governor of Florida was Jeb Bush. So it would have looked like a total banana republic. So she said she could see down the road, as she did, this is where this is going. And she said, we got to resolve this now. Now, the reasoning they used has been attacked, widely attacked. This equal protection argument they use is bad law. What Scalia called excuse my language here, a piece of shit. And it is. But it's sort of her, you know, she's pragmatic on the ranch. When the windmills are broken and the cows are dying, you fix the windmills. And that's the way she was. Now, she regretted it. She felt badly about it. She wished they had never taken the case. So she was not without regret.
So we just have 1 minute, 30 seconds left. I wondered if you could read from here on page 404 to here on page 405 to end.
As you walk up the wide steps of the Supreme Court, you pass between 2 grand marble statues. On the right, a man, authority of law, and on the left, a woman, contemplation of justice. Until Sandra O'Connor arrived, every justice had been a man. She knew the burden she carried, that she would have to be a paragon of far more than legal acuity, that the nation would want a woman who was, as she might put it, attractive. More than an activist for women's rights, she had to play the role of Lady Justice holding the scales. She brought to her job the wisdom that can come from personal suffering, from having a great love and losing it, from being a daughter and a mother, as well as a role model for millions of women.
It's a great book, full of wonderful, wonderful writing. Thank you very much, Evan.
Thank you. Thanks, Doug. That was great. Thanks so much.